In 1966, New York City had a small meningitis outbreak, and officials needed a patient zero, or a culprit if you would. But not having found a legitimate one, they needed a scapegoat. Always the showman, the New York Parks Commissioner Tom Hoving gave them one. That culprit was the common pigeon. You know, those pervasive city-dwelling creatures that seem to set on every building, every telephone wire, on every park bench in every major city. Birds that seemingly outnumber humans 2 to 1 and will happily eat your leftover chips, sandwich crust, and whatever else you leave behind. Hoving, like many New Yorkers, was not a fan. He had had enough of them. And it was in his declaration to the local news that we have the first recorded instance of the term rat with wings. Hoving clearly wasn't a man of history. On one hand, I can't reasonably expect him to know the full history of pigeons and how our coexistence with them is almost entirely our doing. Nor can I expect him to know that, from ancient Egyptian times to Victorian England, pigeons were a common sign of affluence and wealth. But you know, given the time, being only recently removed from the Second World War, I would have expected someone in his position, someone who would make that kind of blanket statement to the masses, to know that merely 20 years prior, the world was actually celebrating pigeons. That's right, there was once a time when pigeons were the most hailed of all animals, literal war heroes. While this may sound like the premise of a children's cartoon, in World War II alone, 54 animals were awarded some Medal of Valor. Of those, 32 were pigeons. To put that into perspective, dogs were awarded nearly half that of pigeons with 18. There were also a few horses, even a cat named Simon, which I should probably talk about at some point, but no animal was as critical to the nations that relied on them in both World War I and World War II as was the humble rat with wings, the most misunderstood and unappreciated of all birds, the humble pigeon. Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about the tragic history of carrier pigeons and how an animal that was once revered and trained by us to be our best friend has now been left to the wayside, nothing more than a common pest animal. It's a thing we've all probably heard of. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of carrier pigeons. But for one, it's such a weird point in history that not a lot of people talk about, but it's also something that I think is important to keep perspective of. I mean, if you live in any urban area, you're probably familiar with pigeons and consider them a nuisance. But the reason they're there is because at one point we valued them being there. We wanted them to be there. So I want to talk about the history of pigeons as they relate to humans for both good and bad. But before we get into that, you may have clicked on this video because you have an interest in war history. And what better thing to do in war history than kill your friends violently in a video game? I hope. That's because this summer, you too can command history. Step aboard the most powerful ships in U.S. naval history with today's sponsor, World of Warships. From the USS Albany to the mighty USS Smith, experience the precision, power, and pride of American naval warfare. Every ship is modeled using real blueprints and historical data, crafted with a staggering level of detail that takes over 6 months each to design. Whether you're launching torpedoes from a stealthy destroyer or raining fire with a high-tier battleship, World of Warships lets you relive legendary naval battles across 40 maps and 7 game modes. Join now using the invite code STEPUP for 7 days of premium, 1 million credits, 500 doubloons, the Stars and Stripes skin, plus 2 iconic US ships, the USS Albany and the USS Smith, for free. New events, historical campaigns, and an active community await. Join clans, strategize in ranked battles, or explore ports inspired by real US harbors. There's always something new to discover. Now, you don't have to just celebrate American naval history, you can live it. Once again, use code STEPUP at the link in the description to download World of Warships free on PC and console today. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring the channel. Their link to download for free will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Now, I don't think that Hoving planned for the moniker of his now infamous quote to have stuck around for over 60 years, or to have the kind of reach that it did. But since New York is the biggest city in the world went with it. Around the same time, however, just a few hundred miles down the road in Langley, Virginia, the Office of R&D for the CIA was looking for new espionage techniques for the Cold War. They were placing recording and photography devices in pins, buttonholed cigarette packs, as well as on our inconspicuous feathered friends. It might surprise you, but long before World War II, pigeons played a huge role in hundreds of other wars and conflicts. Before we get underway, I want to highlight the website Pigeons of War, which has a rather extensive and thorough accounting of today's subject matter that makes for a very interesting rabbit hole to go down. Their research was really instrumental in the making of this video, and I highly recommend paying them a visit if you'd like to learn more. A link will be in the description, credit where it's due. And I mean, also, the website's called Pigeons of War. How could you not check that out. So before we get into the modern application, let's talk about their history. When you think of Charles Darwin's favorite bird, most people probably think of the finch. Darwin, the so-called father of evolutionary biology, famously studied 13 finches on his trip to the Galapagos Islands that helped support his theory of natural selection, which was made famous in his book On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. You all probably went to school at some point, you know this. But ask any Darwin expert and they'll tell you his bird of choice wasn't the finch, it was the common pigeon, also known by its more scientific name, the rock dove. Rock dove also sounds objectively cooler than pigeon. It's like being named Michael and telling people to call you microphone. Although I guess microphone's also kind of cool. Darwin was actually known to visit a high society pigeon club or two, which, yes, was a thing that existed during Victorian times. They were popular in every major city for enthusiasts to sell, swap, and exchange birds and information. So when he wasn't sailing around the world making scientific discoveries on remote unexplored islands, Darwin studied the lofts full of doves that he kept at his home base in London. This collection would form the foundation of his theory on natural selection, as he was able to determine that all of the hundreds of breeds of domesticated pigeons can be traced back to the rock dove, aka the common pigeon. All of this is to say that when I mentioned earlier that pigeons were found on ancient Egyptian farms or Victorian clubs or on the battlefields of the Middle East and France, they all come from the same stock. The same chubby, waddling variant that clung to the scary pigeon lady in Home Alone 2. Now, before they were found everywhere, originally, rock doves came from Western and Southern Europe, North Africa, and a little bit of Southern Asia. The first human interaction with pigeons can be traced back between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. A few archaeologists dug up the earliest depictions of pigeons in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, dating around 3000 BC. It was as far back as this time period that we started farming the rock doves and domesticating them. This makes pigeons one of the oldest domesticated animals, and we did so for a few reasons. The first one is food, which is the most obvious reason, because, back then meat and protein were a lot harder to come by than they are today. So farmers would build dwellings called dovecotes. From the outside, they look like giant beehives, but on the inside, they contained many crevices, nooks, and crannies that mimicked a pigeon's natural habitat. Because, fun fact, pigeons don't live in trees. They are cliff nesters. So in these dovecotes, the birds could feel safe and come and go as they pleased. They would plump up on the feed given to the farmers or go out and forage for food on their own. Then, when someone needed a meal, they'd harvest a pigeon egg or two, and sometimes a whole pigeon to eat like a rotisserie chicken. Stuff it with some rice, onions, and nuts, season with some cinnamon and cumin, then roast it. As the centuries passed, these dovecotes would actually get bigger and more beautiful. It was kind of a measurement of wealth among the rich and famous. Raising pigeons was a show of power. Similar to how old landlords would boast about the size of the pigs they raise or their number of cattle. Basically a look at how much food I have that you don't competition. And in some feudal societies, if you weren't nobility, having a dovecote was illegal with major consequences. Because the royalties pigeon pile looked a lot less impressive if the peasants also had pigeon piles, so had to do away with that. The other reason humans domesticated pigeons was for their guano, or poop. That's because pigeon droppings are rich in nitrogen, which help farmers grow other crops. Basically one of the first instances of fertilizer. And I know this is a little gross, but in times of extreme desperation, in the worst of famines, pigeon poop could be consumed. To give you an idea of how far back people were eating pigeon poop, it's even mentioned in the Bible. In 2 Kings chapter 6 verse 25, it says, "And there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it, until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver." Which, considering that we know pigeon guano was consumed and pigeons were farmed, and we know that all modern pigeons come from the original rock dove, we can assume that this verse in the Bible is talking about eating pigeon poop. And much later on, pigeon guano was the only known source of saltpeter, an essential ingredient in gunpowder. The third reason we would raise them is because, for whatever reason, pigeons just weren't that afraid of humans. They didn't spook easily, we didn't ask questions, so we kept them around. So for all of these traits, those who had pigeons knew that the rest of the world would want these incredibly utilitarian birds. They became a hot commodity on trade routes, and soon, hundreds of breeds of pigeons quickly found themselves traversing all corners of the world. As time went on, the observant humans noticed a few other admirable traits. Chief among them was their insane sense of direction. Pigeons could fly long distances at any time of day, foraging, stretching their wings, doing whatever pigeons do, and still manage to find their way back home to their dovecotes. They were a reliable food source, they're easy to take care of, you can get natural uses like gunpowder out of their dung, and no matter how far they go away from us, they always come back. There have been dozens of theories as to how pigeons are able to do this, from their relationship with the sun, to a unique sense of sound, to beaks that can feel out magnetic fields. The current mainstream scientific theory is that the dove family, and therefore pigeons, have a special protein in their retinas called cryptochromes. This means that they might physically see the Earth's magnetic field. But after many studies, the only thing that we're sure of is that we're not sure. Somehow they always find their way back home, so naturally we had to do something with that. And we did so by making them messengers, or carrier pigeons, as we've come to know them. They proved to be very effective at it, and until the telegraph was invented thousands of years later, these birds were by far the fastest, most efficient method of communication over long distances. Which means for thousands and thousands of years, they would be one of the most useful animals for aiding in human causes, along with horses and dogs. Some of the first known instances of messenger pigeons date back to ancient Egypt. Incoming ships would send a message if a VIP was on board and arriving shortly. The pigeon would fly from the ship to the city to let them know to get the red carpet ready. In other civilizations, kings used to have their human messengers carry pigeons, so if they were captured, the bird would arrive back home, indicating that the messenger was in trouble. Which that in itself is pretty rough. Imagine like you send out a messenger and he has a bird on his back, and then 2 days later just the bird comes back. Well, I guess we'll never see that guy again. Which, quick side note, by the way, if pigeons were known to spread diseases like meningitis, as our friend Tom Hoving declared at the beginning of this video, do you really think that people like royalty would have been using them for so long? I mean, there's thousands of years of them taking messages to the most important people all over the world. Lords, kings, generals, and obviously, the most important, very, very rich people. Like, sure, they're a bird. They can carry bird illnesses, but they don't, like, invent them. There would have been evidence of that at some point. The most well-known story of a pigeon-human communication belongs to Noah. Yet another mention of pigeons in the Bible, funny enough. On the 40th day of the Great Flood, you know, Noah and the ark and all that, Noah sent out a dove, and when it returned, Noah understood that to mean that there was nowhere for it to perch, and therefore no land to settle. A week later, Noah sent that dove out again, and this time it returned with an olive branch, which meant the water was receding, a sign to prepare for life on land once again. And despite this example of a messenger bird carrying an olive branch, they would eventually be used extensively in war. One of, if not the first, documented uses of a pigeon in war came after Julius Caesar's assassination, when birds were sent out to warn of a civil war breaking out in Rome. One of the generals documented the bird's use, writing that one of Caesar's consuls, quote, shut up pigeons in the dark, starve them, fasten letters to their necks by a hair, and then release them as near to the city walls as he could. The birds, eager for light and food, sought the highest buildings and were received by Brutus, who in that way was informed of everything, especially after he set food in certain spots and taught the pigeons to alight there. This laid the groundwork for future military training. Around the Middle Ages, pigeons became common use courier services between noble houses with messages attached to legs. Don't let Game of Thrones fool you. It was the pigeon, not the raven, that was used. Although ravens objectively look cooler, but now we're just being mean. But it was during this time that the Crusades happened, a centuries-long conflict between European Christians and Muslims. Having basically invented carrier pigeons thousands of years prior in the Fertile Crescent, the Muslims had the upper hand when it came to the quick long-distance messaging. But the Crusaders quickly caught on and adopted the practice themselves, and actually got quite good at intercepting these pigeons. Falconeers would train and release falcons to hunt the pigeons. And because the Crusaders crusaded over a lot of ground, so did their tactics. Nearly every major military in the world began to adopt a homing pigeon strategy, which means they would play a huge role if war ever broke out involving the entire world. But what are the chances of that, right? I guess the chances were pretty high considering that it happened twice. Their millennia of breeding and usage as messengers made them strategic animal allies to their human soldier counterparts. As the U.S. Department of Agriculture explained, quote, whenever war broke out, from the Spanish-American War to World War II, clubs and pigeon keepers always joined the rest of the nation's patriotic sacrifices with willingness to sacrifice even more pigeons to serve their country. Which, like, sure, the pigeon keeper is sacrificing their pigeons in the war, but you know who else is also sacrificing? The pigeons. As I mentioned earlier, pigeons became a high society status symbol a little before the Victorian era, when food storage technology was much improved and farming pigeons was no longer necessary. Enthusiasts all over the world would hunt and pack and trade and barter for pigeons with unique colors, head plumage, and even feathered feet. Nikola Tesla, Pablo Picasso, even a few queens of England were known to partake. I mean, they were animals that were well trained, calm around humans, and existed around high members of society and militaries for generations. So it makes sense that people wanted to keep them around. I also swear I remember there being some story that Nikola Tesla married his pigeon. Hold on. Okay, I should clarify. The state of New York did not let him legally betroth a pigeon, but he did have a very close connection to a white pigeon and claimed to have loved it as a man loves a woman. So, close enough. This trickled down a bit as time went on, and, well, I should clarify, not the marrying the pigeon or falling in love with it thing, common law marriage to a pigeon, whatever. Not that. Keeping them became a thing that caught on. And as pigeon keeping became a hobby, it became a pretty popular one. During World War I, U.S. Major General Pershing posted notices in pigeon clubs and the Squab Journal, a publication for pigeon enthusiasts, asking for civilians to step up and do their part. One headline read, "Pershing asked for racing pigeons," which then goes on to note that sure, technology has nearly made their skills obsolete, and then says, quote, "but it now becomes apparent they are still useful." Pershing was calling for any and all homing pigeons to deliver important field messages that included troop movements, assignments, staff reports, and reports from patrols and reconnaissance units. These were not unimportant messages. All sides of the war would know that, allies, and enemies. Knowing the potential fate of their pets and friends, many patriots stepped up and contributed to the cause. In the United States alone, Americans offered up nearly 10,000 homing pigeons, as well as their own training and handling services to the United States Army Pigeon Service, also known as the Signal Pigeon Corps. By this time, telegraphing and more updated lines of communication did exist. However, encryption technology was not very strong. Messages sent over phone lines and telegraphs and Morse code ran the risk of being intercepted, and worse, intercepted without knowing that they were intercepted. While pigeons also ran that risk to some extent, it was a much lower rate. According to the U.S. War Department manual at the time, strategic pigeon messaging yielded a 99% success rate. So while sure you may have technology or telegram lines set up to deliver messages, sometimes the best means was by air. The United States military trained their new aerial recruits using intel and info from all the way back in the dovecote days of the Roman Empire and the Crusades. This included how to feed, receive, and create a memorable home for the pigeons to enable optimal performance. For instance, it was of the utmost importance to only feed pigeons liberally on their first meal in their new dovecotes, but never again after that. That way, they always associate the dovecote as the place they're going to get the most food. So no matter how far away they go, they'll always return there. Military homing pigeons were split into two categories: mobile and stationary. The mobile birds were specifically trained to adapt to new environments within 24 hours. They did so by recognizing their dovecotes and lofts as home rather than any geographic features. They were the birds serving in the field, or in the trenches, as they say. Even the pigeoneers were held to a high standard. They were required, like every other soldier, to go through basic training to be neat and tidy, alert and attentive. But one of their more critical roles was identifying the best pigeons for breeding. Pigeons that had quality feathers, proper eye anatomy, the right size, and the most easygoing temperaments. These were the birds that they wanted to have offspring. But as honorable as the sacrifices of these pigeons were, there are a few such heroes worth mentioning by name. One of the most famous war pigeons was the soldier, and yes, I said soldier, Cher Ami, which translates to dear friend. Cher Ami was a mobile homing pigeon who had a major assist in one of the most famous stories to come from the First World War, the story of the Lost Battalion. It goes like this. About 500 infantry from the 77th Division found themselves cut off from the rest of the American troops in the Argonne Forest in northeast France behind German lines. They were under heavy bombing from the Germans and their radio signal got cut. Because the Americans were unaware of the 77th's location, they started counterbombing the Germans in the same area, dangerously close to their own men. The situation was incredibly dire, with hundreds of lives already lost and dozens more by the minute. The 77th were taking fire from the Germans and their own men. The commanding officer, Major Charles Whittlesey had to find a way to get word out to please stop bombing their own men. In addition to falcons that were still used to hunt messenger birds, homing pigeons now had to dodge barrages of bullets in order to deliver. In both world wars, militaries had spotters and sharpshooters specifically trained to look for pigeons. I mean, think about it. If you're in the trenches and you see a pigeon take off, that pigeon could be going back to their lines to order artillery to fire on your location, so you better get those birds down. Whittlesey sent pigeon after pigeon, only to watch each and every one get shot down in some form or another, finally coming down to their last one. Cherami. As Whittlesey sent the bird, he watched it take multiple hits, including from a piece of shrapnel. At one point, soldiers said they saw Cherami hit the ground after taking a bullet, but he stood up, took off, and heroically flew 25 miles in 30 minutes. Almost 60 miles an hour. There's a movie of the same name, The Lost Battalion, with a great scene that shows Cherami taking off during heavy targeted fire and eventually landing at his destination bloodied and limping. In an excellent piece of bird acting, I might add. Then being scooped up with the message containing coordinates as well as the message, "Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop." Cherami's right leg was gone and he was blinded, but medics were able to save his life after he potentially saved the lives of nearly 200 American soldiers. Unfortunately, he succumbed to his wounds soon thereafter, and to this day, Cherami is on display in the Smithsonian, a hero of World War I. Literally, with Cherami's last breath, made it back home to deliver the message and then died. So yes, I will call that bird a soldier. But Cherami isn't the only notable pigeon story from the war. Contrary to the name, stationary pigeons were our cross-country runners, trained longer and more thoroughly so they could fly distances of 100 miles or more, which that really puts into perspective how valuable they were. Could you imagine in the midst of a war running telegram lines for hundreds of miles when you can instead just have a bird do it in one go? Well, that brings us to our next pigeon, Gustave. In World War II, Gustave, a part of the Royal Air Force, which is Great Britain's Air Force, was often assigned for special missions, including a top-secret program developed by the British military intelligence to make contact with a member of the resistance across Nazi-occupied Europe. Between 1941 and 1945, members of the Royal Air Force dropped 16,000 boxes of pigeons in these areas with sheets of paper, a pencil, and a tube for storing messages, along with instructions on how to write and pack the message. Over half the messages the Royal Air Force received contain useful information about the Nazis. Pigeons like Gustave were dropped off in Belgium to fly behind enemy lines to pick up and carry these messages, and Gustave specifically flew this mission for 2 years. For one, the concept of the Air Force flying over and doing coordinated pigeon drops is wild. But also, again, you can't have guys go in on the ground deep behind German lines and run phone lines or deliver messages on the ground. But if you train these pigeons right, it's like cheating. People can get messages from behind enemy lines straight back home with no one in the middle to take them down unless they physically shoot down the bird. Eventually, Gustave was paired with a Reuters journalist who observed as Allied troops landed and swarmed on the beaches of Normandy. Realizing what was happening, which of course we know now was D-Day, the journalist scribbled a message and stuffed it into Gustave's leg holder. Flying from an Allied warship for over 150 miles, over 5 hours non-stop against an especially fierce 30 to 50 mile per hour headwind, Gustave delivered the message pictured here. Officials immediately telephoned London with the news. This dispatch was the first report received in Britain about the landings in Normandy. That is right, the first report that D-Day was happening in Great Britain during the war came from a pigeon. After the war, Gustave received the Dickon Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victorian Cross, and was returned to his owner, where he lived a long, happy life. There's too many of these pigeon stories, I can't stop. The next is Old Anchor. Old Anchor was discovered in May of 1918 by a group of British and American naval vessels who were laying mines off the Scottish coast. Growing tired, the pigeon touched down on one of the ships, clearly fatigued, when the crew noticed a leg band identifying it as property of the German Navy. While it was possible that the bird had simply strayed during a training mission, the sailors preferred a more entertaining theory, that the pigeon had defected from the enemy and now joined the Allied forces. After being taken in by the Navy, Old Anchor, which of course the Navy gave him that name, was transferred to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he became part of a new breeding program. Over time, he contributed to the birth of many of the fort's most successful pigeons. Between 1928 and 1933, his offspring frequently excelled in long-distance races spanning 600 to 700 miles, which that pigeon made the best decision of his life. He was in the midst of the war for Germany, and then he landed on an Allied boat, which I like to think that, yes, he did defect and become a double agent. And the people that found him were like, hey, buddy, we're going to send you back home. You don't have to be in the war anymore. And now see all these lady pigeons? Have fun. Old Anchor died on April 5th, 1939, some 20 years after he was found. In recognition of his contributions, the personnel at Fort Monmouth crafted a custom wooden coffin and held a full military funeral in his honor, complete with a 21-gun salute. But we're not done there. We also have Old Satchelback. Old Satchelback is notable because he was known as the laziest homing pigeon in the military. The complete opposite of a stationary, well, he was stationary, but he wasn't a stationary. Old Satchelback hated flying for long stretches, so he frequently cut his flies short, opting to walk most of the way instead. Which, I mean, you've seen pigeons walk. It's probably something like a half mile an hour, right? All the other pigeons are flying, and then he shows up like a day late, just waddling home. In August of 1918, American divisions were stationed along the Vesle River in France as they pushed German troops back past the river. Amongst violent battles that included the use of flamethrowers and fierce gunfights in the streets, Old Satchelback was released with a message for headquarters. But, as always, he quickly grew tired of flying and opted to walk instead, opting to walk on a nearby road. A road that specifically was marked with craters from multiple mortar shells, which engineers were filling with dirt. According to legend, Old Satchelback patiently waited for the crew to finish, then, quote, strutted majestically over the new-made highway. The awestruck engineers quit what they were doing to watch this and then later reported the sighting to their colleagues. Like, not only would Old Satchelback not fly, but if he came to a hole in the road, he would stand still until someone fixed the hole for him. He could not even be bothered to walk around the side of the hole, much less fly. After one too many reports of the walking homing pigeon, the military decided to ground Old Satchelback. But they didn't retire him. They actually found that he was an incredibly therapeutic bird for pigeons who were shell-shocked from their flights. Yes, as you can imagine, some of the pigeons that suddenly ran into anti-aircraft fire and a bunch of things exploded around them weren't so keen on flying in the future. Several of these birds would be too shocked to land, instead circling nervously overhead, making it impossible for those on the ground to retrieve any of their attached messages. Which this obviously would be a problem. There's people out in the middle of a battle trying to deliver a message, but the message can't be delivered because the bird's too afraid to land. So Old Satchelback would fly up to circle next to them and attempt to lead them back down towards their home. Old Satchelback didn't work out in the field, but as soon as they got him back to base camp, he seemingly knew the other pigeons were afraid to land and would fly up to lead them to the ground. Reportedly, the other pigeon almost always tagged along by the second or third attempt. The pigeon acted as like a counselor for other pigeons in the middle of combat. He was effectively a pigeon chaplain. There are so many other one-off stories about pigeons in war times. Again, I highly recommend Pigeons of War at the link in the description. These are just a few of the more interesting ones we found, but I could talk about them all day. Interestingly, pigeons were also the first drones. A German inventor, Dr. Julius Neubronner, devised a small camera that could fit around the body of a pigeon, then created a mobile dovecote using a horse-drawn trailer with a darkroom attached to it. Though they are intelligent creatures, the pigeon could not necessarily learn what to take pictures of, so surveillance depended on the whim of the pigeon. I mean, sometimes you get a really good picture, other times it's just like a piece of bread, I guess, whatever pigeons look at in their free time. But the idea of a whole darkroom attached to a horse-drawn trailer is insane. Do you see what I mean? Like, this is such a wild thing in history that not a lot of people talk about. They were hooking up dark rooms to carriages so that pigeons with cameras strapped to them could have their photos developed in the field. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, in the 60s and 70s, the CIA started experimenting with pigeons for espionage. And at this point, there were 5,000 years of human-oriented proliferation. Pigeons were out there, everywhere. And it's not really an accident. Unlike most birds of flight, pigeons don't nest in trees to survive. They prefer to dwell and nest in rock formations and the nooks and crannies of cliff faces. And cities are known for having tall buildings, and these taller buildings with their ornate designs, ledges, and air conditioning units do a really good job of mimicking their natural habitats. As Elizabeth Carlin and Joanne Moles say in their TED Ed Talk, they have a, quote, notoriously low bar when it comes to homemaking. Add some sticks to any window ledge and overpass, and it's a great spot to raise babies. Pigeons also don't need to feed their young meals that are high in protein, like grubs and insects, like other birds do. They feed them with naturally occurring crop milk, which comes from their own esophagus. The mother can live off a diet of Fritos and French fries found in a parking lot and still feed her babies. Pair this with a long breeding season and man-made cities that basically serve as massive dovecote ecosystems, and it'd be crazy not to expect them to be one of the most abundant and widespread animals on Earth, especially considering the fact we used to want to have them around us. So the CIA decided to use this to their advantage. If pigeons are everywhere, and cameras can be the size of pinholes, then the combination would make for a very good inconspicuous spy. In a document that was recently declassified, Operation Takana tells of the $100,000 spent developing pigeon spies, and even shows off a few shockingly detailed photos. So, we bred the pigeons to peacefully coexist along with us, used them for our human needs, and subjected them to war. So why all the hate, right? I mean, they've been such allies to us for thousands of years. Why suddenly are they just rats with wings? There's a term in sociology. It's imaginative geography. In essence, there's a line of distinction that separates orderly, man-made civilization from the rest of the wild, natural world. As sociologist Colin Gerlach puts it, quote, that doesn't mean there's no nature, but ideally the city is the place where we invite nature in ways that we can control. You know, things like little parks or trees on our sidewalks or koi ponds in our backyards. We like the idea that the pieces of nature we let in are selective and things we want to be there. A lot of you probably have a dog in your house, but if you walked out of your bedroom and saw a wolf in your living room, you may be significantly more upset. Most people probably don't know and probably don't care whether or not humans had anything to do with why pigeons exist in our cities. I think most people believe that pigeons just are. They're invasive, annoying, gross. They poop everywhere. They aren't thinking about the fact that for centuries, we wanted, even needed them around. We bred them, kept them, used them, these dumb, obnoxious birds who are actually so much smarter than we give them credit for. Creatures that can fly for hundreds of miles and deliver messages that saved countless lives. Studies have proven that we have actually increased the IQ of the common pigeon over time. In her book, Super Dove, Courtney Humphreys makes the argument that feral pigeons are, quote, aesthetically and scientifically fascinating. And she argues that we should respect the biological and social freaks of nature, and I personally agree. Pigeons in their modern state seem highly underrated and vastly misunderstood. But of course, all of this went over Tom Hoving's head, and with one quick quip, he tainted the brand of a bird that for so long served us so well. And also, the term rats with wings. Like, I understand rats can be in gross places, but rats are also, like, super intelligent, and they can be taught to, like, exist along humans and make really good pets, and they can solve puzzles. That's why we use them for so many experiments like mazes and stuff like that. Like, I understand it can be dirty, but it's also a really smart, whatever. I think the story of pigeons is fascinating. Imagine if, like, we just decided we didn't want dogs in like 50 years, and then dogs just show up around cities as strays, and we treat them like pest animals. We do everything we can to get rid of them. I mean, the only reason that they're around is because we invited them in. Now it's just kind of sad that people don't like them, and now they don't have anywhere else to go. We took all their natural habitat and made them live around us, so they're just doing what they think we want them to do. So the next time you see a pigeon out there, maybe, you know, throw them a piece of bread every now and then, if you're in a place that allows for that, I guess. I mean, that is a veteran after all. This is just a really weird point in history that, once again, I don't think gets talked about enough, but hopefully now you've learned something that you can put to use and bore someone with in the future. And I think that's great, and we just want to say thank you for watching. This was really funny because I think when I approached the team with this idea, they were like, what? Why do you want a carrier pigeon video? But hopefully I've made that point clear. They probably still think I'm crazy for wanting to do it. But the researchers, writers did a fantastic job. As always, link will be in the description. Be sure to show them some love. Really, hyped about, the team we have, all the cool people that are working together to get these videos across. I'm so glad that you guys are enjoying it. Hopefully you continue to enjoy it and you don't hate me. You can hate me, that's fine. Just don't hate them. They do great work. So links to some of the stuff. Be sure to check out Pigeons of War. Such an insane website. Can I get a pigeon? Pigeons can be kept as pets like everywhere? Yeah, you can just have pigeons. That's great. Oh, you need a permit because they're wild animals in some states? Okay, well, what's the difference? Because if you build like the hut that they recognize as their home and you feed them there, they're going to come back. So what's the difference between I own a pigeon and the pigeon just so happens to live in my backyard and we hang out sometimes? You can really do that with any animal. You can have like just be a tiger in the woods and it's like, yeah, well, I don't own the tiger, but I live next to where the tiger lives, so we're like neighbors and we're chill. I mean, someone would probably get mad at that, but I'm going to figure out the pigeon thing. I will have a pigeon. You'll see. And once again, thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring the video, and be sure to use code STEPUP when you get it for free at the link below. New content on the way. Thank you all so much for the love and support. It means the world, and I believe that should do it for now, but we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.